Hi, I'm Matt Donnelly. It's Friday, and we are heading into week number 5, which means it is time to get hyped for the weekend with the Fantasy Points Friday Night Hype Show. We are going to preview the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Cleveland Browns, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Arizona Cardinals, the Dallas Cowboys, the Los Angeles Rams, and of course, the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens. But first, before we get into this week's slate of games, here are some notable injuries to keep an eye on here as we head into Sunday's contests. Daniel Jones, he's got that ankle injury. Tyrod Taylor, concussion. There's going to be another quarterback that gets pulled into this. Hearing from the Giants beat writers right now, Tyrod Taylor is probably not making the trip to London. Also, Kadarius Toney did not participate there on Thursday after being limited on Wednesday, so you can pretty much count him out this weekend. And Wan'Dale Robinson, he was limited on Wednesday, limited again on Thursday. They've got games in London on Sunday morning. Now, for the New York Football Jets, Breece Hall, he's got some nicks and bruises. There's no such thing to worry about in that one there. Now, David Montgomery did not participate on Wednesday. He was limited on Thursday. There is a chance that he's going to play on Sunday, but I wouldn't count on it. Rashad Bateman, hey, Harbaugh thinks it's a thing. He thinks he's going to be able to be there. He's still dealing with that foot injury. Again, watch those practice reports. Mac Jones, ankle injury. He's going to give it a go. He's going to try, but he may not get that opportunity. Now, Axel, Brian Hoyer there, concussion. He's on the IR, which means we can get more Bailey Zappi this week. And you know what? The world needs more Zappi. Now, Tom Brady, he's got a bit of a finger issue there, a little bit of a shoulder issue. Don't worry. He's going to play. Rashad Penny, he showed up on the injury report today here on Thursday. Detroit Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown ankle, missed Thursday's practice. Now, the Lions, they have a bye week next week, so you might not see him again until week number 7. And that goes for DeAndre Swift as well, who is doubtful. Michael Thomas, he's still dealing with a toe injury. There's a chance that he could end up on IR at some point. I'm not too sure what's going to happen, but really, Michael Thomas and injuries, does anything surprise you nowadays? Alvin Kamara, on the other hand, though, he is trending in the right direction there, dealing with that rib injury after that surprise deactivation there in London a week ago. Isaiah McKenzie, Buffalo Bills wide receiver, he's dealing with a concussion. He's trending in the right direction right now as of this moment. Dawson Knox, again, the Bills' foot, hamstring, did not participate on Thursday. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Hunter Renfrow, he had a concussion there back in week 2 there against Arizona. He missed weeks 3 and weeks 4. He returned to practice on Wednesday. That means he was practicing on Thursday. Right now, again, trending in the right direction. Boy, the Raiders need him this week. Jahan Dotson, their hamstring injury, doubtful this week. We got Kenny Golladay, MCL. And you know what? Don't even count him to begin with. Kyle Pitts was a surprise show up there on the Thursday practice report. He was not spotted at practice there in Atlanta, so something that might be monitored as we head into Sunday's contests. Now, here are the slate of games here for this week, starting with, we got the New York Giants and the Green Bay Packers in London. London is calling, but who are the Giants calling for a quarterback and wide receiver help? It seems like every wide receiver and every quarterback is dealing with some kind of ailment. Pittsburgh at Buffalo, the Kenny Pickett era is officially underway, but in Buffalo, good luck, kid. Houston and Jacksonville. Will James Robinson bounce back this week? He had an abysmal week number 4 last week. He's not really getting a whole lot after first contact there, so it's something fantasy managers need to be aware of when it comes to James Robinson. But hey, Houston and their run defense, they'll pretty much heal just about anything that's ailing you. Now, Chicago at Minnesota, please, for the love of everything that is holy, let Justin Fields throw the ball. Cooper Kupp has more receptions, 42, than Justin Fields has completions this season. That's where we're at. That's why I can't handle myself anymore. Detroit at New England. Does Bill Belichick even have kneecaps to bite anymore? Seattle at New Orleans. I'm not going to lie. This game just missed the cut for Russell Wilson through 4 games this season. Is 80 for 131 there, a 61.1% completion percentage, 980 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception. Geno Smith through the same 4-game period, 102 of 132 for a 77.3%. That leads the NFL in completion percentage. He's thrown for 1,037 yards, 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Geno Smith is outscoring Russell Wilson by almost 2.5 fantasy points per game. Man, I love myself some Geno. Miami at New York. This could be this week's low-key game of the week here, kind of like Seattle and Detroit was last week. Atlanta at Tampa Bay. Brady and this offense looking to work through some things here this week after a disappointing result in Kansas City last week. Tennessee at Washington. Derrick Henry versus this Commanders defensive line. San Francisco at Carolina. Hey, I just want to see DJ Moore happy at this point. Is that too much to ask for? Is that too much to ask for? Now, Las Vegas versus Kansas City. Ketchup does not belong on steak. There, take that, Patrick Mahomes. That's the best I got right now. Now let's get into the games that have me excited. for week number 5, starting with the Los Angeles Chargers heading to Cleveland to take on the Cleveland Browns. For the Chargers, let's turn our attention to the running back here. Let's talk about Austin Ekeler. After a big week against the Houston Texans, Ekeler is once again amongst the top 12 fantasy running backs in terms of fantasy points per game in PPR formats. It helps when you have 109 scrimmage yards there, 6 receptions, 3 touchdowns, and 19.5 fantasy points per game, trails only Saquon Barkley and Nick Chubb, who has 21.4 through 4 weeks. I mean, like I said, Houston, this defense will help you get better no matter how you want to look at it from an offensive standpoint. Prior to that contest, Ekeler was averaging less than 2.5 yards per carry and wasn't even earning a 60% snap share. While the numbers as far as snaps and carries didn't overly increase, his effectiveness did, catching 6 of 7 passes for 49 yards, averaging 4.6 yards per carry on his 13 attempts. Over the last 2 weeks, Ekeler has a 17.9% target share, which is the 5th best mark amongst running backs over that period. Now, looking at the other pass catchers here in this Chargers offense, obviously we need to follow the practice reports as we have for the last couple weeks as it pertains to Keenan Allen. Allen has been out since week number 2 with that hamstring injury. I think he's trending in the right direction, but then again, I thought this last week. Without Keenan Allen in the lineup, Mike Williams is averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game, which is about 3 points higher than when Allen is available. Now, finally, let's talk about Justin Herbert here. Herbert leads the NFL in passing yards with 1,250, and he has done this without Keenan Allen. He has done this without Rashawn Slater, that safety there on his backside, that left tackle there. I'm not sure what the actual mathematic conversion is here, but if this all basically projects out to about 5,300 passing yards, and that is without his wide receiver one. Herbert is just one of 2 quarterbacks in NFL history to throw for 300 or more yards in 7 consecutive road games. Hey, guess where the Chargers are this week? They're on the road. The Cleveland Browns are only allowing 15.9 fantasy points per contest there to the quarterback position there, while surrendering just 888 passing yards and 5 touchdowns in 4 games. However, Herbert is not your typical quarterback there, as he has thrown for over 300 yards 19 times since the start of the 2020 season, which is the most in the National Football League. For the Cleveland Browns entering this week, Nick Chubb, he trails only Saquon Barkley as far as rushing yards are concerned there. And through a quarter of the season there, he has 459 of them. Chubb leads the NFL in runs over 20 with 5 of them, which certainly helps pad those statistics. Looking at Chubb's fantasy output thus far this season, it's even more impressive when you take the fact that Chubb has been a top 12 fantasy running back each week, despite not seeing the same uptick in volume in the passing game as some of these other running backs. The Chargers have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game this season to opposing backs there, allowing 6.1 yards per carry to opposing backs. So seeing Chubb this week, who averages 5.7, is probably the last thing that the Chargers really wanted to see. Now, I'm not a smart man by any stretch of anyone's imagination here, but if Chubb continues to keep on with that pace, he is a lock for 20-plus carries, and if he's averaging 5.0 yards per carry, well, you know what? That works out to another 100-yard performance. Basic mathematics there. Mathematics for Dummies right here presented to you by Matt Donnelly. Now, the passing game volume for the Cleveland Browns has been getting eaten up lately by David Njoku and Amari Cooper. Now, Njoku's route participation is 5th amongst tight ends there at 79%. After seeing just 6 targets in the first 2 weeks, Njoku now has 14 receptions on 17 targets these past 2 weeks. That has pushed him up to tight end 11 in PPR formats. Now, Brissett, he has been serviceable this season, ranking in the middle of the pack in adjusted completion rate. It also helps that when he's got Amari Cooper clicking there, which wasn't quite the case last week. That said, Cooper has accounted for a 25% target share thus far this season and over 38% of the Browns' air yards, despite just having 9 yards and on 4 targets there a week ago. Whether J.C. Jackson or Asante Samuel are lining opposite Cooper, you can expect good numbers from Cooper for fantasy, as Samuel has been the better of the 2 corners, and he's still allowing a 90.6 passer rating along with a 65% catch rate. Los Angeles, as a team, their defense against wide receivers for fantasy, it hasn't been good. Actually, it's been pretty much non-existent. They are allowing 38.8 fantasy points per game, which is the 10th most this season, to receivers. So even a guy like Donovan Peoples-Jones, he is definitely worthy of a flex play this week. Next up on the docket, the Philadelphia Eagles heading out west to take on the Arizona Cardinals. This game is going to provide a bigger test for the Eagles than many are probably considering right now. Historically, the Eagles have struggled whenever they have been asked to make that cross-country trip heading out west. Going back to 2008, that NFC Championship game, the Cardinals hold a 6-2 advantage over the birds of a different feather, and Philadelphia has not defeated the Cardinals in State Farm Stadium, which opened back in 2005. Now, looking at the Eagles in particular here, the Eagles make this list again this week, mostly because they are very highly thought of among those who sign my checks. That, and they're pretty darn good. Now, I want to believe that the Eagles are finally going to start using Miles Sanders a little bit more, but I really have a hard time trusting them, and it's really hard to trust Sanders. Sanders against the Jaguars last week finished with a pair of scores on the ground along with 134 yards on 27 carries, meaning he's probably in for a week where he gets with 7 carries against this Cardinals team that is actually allowing 23.23 fantasy points per game to opposing backs. Now, don't look now, but after a top 3 fantasy performance last week, Sanders now finds himself entering this week's contest as the RB9. And again, facing that Arizona Cardinals team that is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to running backs this season. Okay. I know I talk fast. I'm trying to get a lot of information in a very short period of time here, but now I've waited too long to talk about Jalen Hurts. I mean, I can literally do a 30-minute video on Jalen Hurts and how much I love this man. Now, remember what people were saying, that Jalen Hurts isn't a quarterback and that all his productivity there is directly tied into his ability to run? Well, part of that is true. I mean, he can run, but he can also pass the ball as well. And this Eagles passing offense is the best in the National Football League, getting it done on early downs there, averaging 8.7 yards per attempt. Hurts has been so good and so efficient early on games that often the Eagles are coasting in the second half, and Hurts does not need to do what he's been able to do. Hurts has over 900 passing yards in the first halves of games alone this season, while adding another 150 yards on the ground and a total of 8 touchdowns. That's in the first half of his games. That's not even including the second half. He's actually better in the first half than like 95% of the quarterbacks are throughout an entire game. Now, both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith have benefited from Jalen Hurts' early MVP-type season he's putting together there, as both have seen at least 20% target share through the first 4 weeks, and each have had wide receiver 1 type weeks so far. Now, Brown last week had a 29% target share against the Jaguars, and he produced 95 yards on 5 receptions. Now, while the Cardinals do rank 7th when it comes to yielding fantasy production to the wide receiver position, the interesting matchup within the matchup here shows that the Eagles have produced the 4th most yards after the catch this season, whereas the Cardinals have actually yielded the most yards after the catch, and we all know what A.J. Brown does best. It's after the catch. Now, for Arizona, both Zach Ertz and Marquise Brown rank inside the top 20 in terms of receptions so far this season, with Ertz commanding an impressive 44% target share inside the red zone, trailing only DK Metcalf. Hollywood Brown once again finished a week with a target share of 36% and accounted for 47% of the Cardinals' air yards. He was one of 9 players to finish with a target share of greater than 30% and an air yard share of over 40%. Now, Brown has run 150 routes so far this season, resulting in 339 yards, which has him inside the top 10. You know that the Eagles will be looking to remove Brown from the equation this week with a healthy dose of the big play, Darius Slay. So someone's going to have to step up, and, well, it's probably not going to be Greg Dortch, because that experiment was fun while it lasted. With the return of Rondale Moore, Dortch, he took a back seat last week, seeing just 1 catch for 6 yards. Moore was on the field on 2 wide receiver sets 75% of the time last week with a 95% route participation. What is even more interesting is Moore's average depth of target there, that A-dot, which had been 1.2 in his rookie season, was up to 10.4 last week, which is even more impressive when you consider how much Kyler Murray has struggled at pushing that ball down the field. Maybe something that is worth monitoring in Arizona is the fact that Rondale Moore is actually running more patterns and less gadget plays, playing about 39% of his routes, going for over 5 yards down the field. That is more than double in comparison to what he did in his rookie season. Can we talk about Kyler Murray's A-dot here? I feel like it hasn't been talked about nearly enough. After 2 seasons of 8.5 yards per attempt, he is currently seeing an average depth of target at 5.84, which is the 4th worst among qualified quarterbacks. And I don't feel that we're talking about this enough. I mean, this seems to be a very important detail that if some other quarterbacks were lacking in, we'd be definitely talking about it, probably bring it to the surface with a lot more conviction. Now, I love myself a revenge game. So revenge game alert here. Zach Ertz faces off against the Eagles. And you know he's had this one circled in his calendar for quite some time. Ertz is among the tight end leaders in targets and routes. And that is not likely to change, at least not until DeAndre Hopkins returns in week number 7. Now, the third game on our docket, we've got the Dallas Cowboys at the Los Angeles Rams, where the Rams are actually 4.5-point favorites, which I'm not quite buying that line. Now, Dallas, Cooper Rush is now 4-0 as the Cowboys starter and has led this team to a 3-0 record this season since that injury to Dak Prescott back in week number 1. Well, you want to believe that Dak Prescott's not going to get Wally pipped along the way and that he's going to be the starting quarterback once he returns. If Rush beats the Rams this week, you have to keep him as a starter. At least you have to think he does, right? I mean, 4-0, keeping it alive. I mean, Dak, that's not a good situation to put Dak Prescott in. Everyone's favorite quarterback is always the backup quarterback. Now, CeeDee Lamb, he is hogging some targets, and his production has been solid since that first week. Looking at all 4 weeks this season, Lamb's lowest target share was 26%. He's followed that up with weeks of 34%, 41%, and last week, 32% in Michael Gallup's return. Gallup's return means things are going to start opening up for Lamb and this Dallas Cowboys offense. Now, Lamb, who has 288 yards receiving this season and 2 touchdowns. Gallup, he's going to stretch these defenses. I talked about how this is going to open things up. Gallup is a field stretcher, something that has been missing in this Cowboys attack for quite some time. Lamb currently has 12 targets of greater than 15 yards down the field, and honestly, that's not really his strength. Well, Gallup only saw a 9% target share in his return. He did catch 2 of those passes for 24 yards, and he did have a touchdown. So, hey, welcome back, Gallup. With the way that this Rams defense has been giving it up to receivers, and trust me, they've been giving it up. If Gallup has another game where he gets about an 85% plus route participation, this week you can expect him to increase those targets and those yardage numbers. Lamb managers, you better hope that Dak Prescott misses some more time. Per Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points, Lamb has hit 15 fantasy points in 6 contests there since week number 8 of the 2021 season. 4 of those 6 games have come with Cooper Rush under center. Even better news for those that are starting Lamb and Michael Gallup this week. LA has been bad at defending opposing receivers this season, allowing an average of 47.98 fantasy points per contest, which trails only the Baltimore Ravens. It doesn't help when you've allowed the second most touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, 6 of them, which is 1 fewer than the Washington Commanders. Just when we were finally starting to get ready to bury Ezekiel Elliott in this Cowboys backfield, we get a game like we had last week from Tony Pollard. Yes, I started him, and no, I'm not over it. Pollard averaged 0.8 yards per carry, albeit against a tough Commanders front there. But 6 yards on 8 carries, that's not going to cut it. There's a reason why there is so much pain in my voice. Now, this week, Elliott and Pollard face a Rams defense that has allowed 284 yards on the ground through 4 weeks and has allowed 13.48 fantasy points per game, which happens to be the lowest. So if you're thinking this is a bounce back week, that's probably not going to happen. Now, for the Los Angeles Rams, first, we need to address how bad this LA Rams offensive line has been to truly understand why Matthew Stafford has looked as bad as he's looked this season. Stafford has had no time to throw the ball. His deep ball rate of 6% is the 3rd lowest in the NFL, while his ADOT ranks 5th from the bottom at just 6.1. Last season, Stafford ranked top 5 in both those categories. And through the first 4 weeks, Stafford's only got 4 touchdowns, and he's throwing 6 interceptions. He has thrown 3 more touchdowns to his own team than he has thrown to the other team so far. Now, maybe all that UCL and elbow talk in the offseason was much bigger than what we were led to believe, because he just hasn't looked right, whether it's the time or whether it's the elbow. Now, one thing that we all have noticed is that when teams force the issue there with the Rams, Stafford, he has struggled. Last season, Stafford tore up teams that blitzed him, but he struggled against teams that brought pressure without sending any additional bodies his way. Well, Dallas, they can bring it, and they have brought it all season, recording 6 sacks in 4 games, led by Micah Parsons, who has 4 sacks this season, followed by Dorrance Armstrong and DeMarcus Lawrence, who have 3 apiece. It's not all bad, at least for Cooper Kupp managers, as Kupp has more receptions, 42 on 54 targets, than Justin Fields has completions. I just mentioned this, 34 completions for Justin Fields this season. Cooper Kupp is literally outperforming his 2021 fantasy campaign. Through 4 weeks, Kupp is averaging 27.1 fantasy points per contest. That's 1.4 more fantasy points per game than he had last season. After Kupp, it has been Tyler Higbee, not Allen Robinson, in the target pecking order, as Higbee has been targeted 38 times, hauling in 26 of those targets, earning himself top 5 tight end status early on in the season. Remember, Higbee couldn't catch nothing last season there. He was getting like 3 catches for like 36 yards per game. Well, that's up to about 6 catches and 61 yards per game. Higbee currently sits 2nd in targets, 1st in targets per route, and 4th in yards so far this season. Now, I would like to talk about the Rams' run game, But honestly, there's nothing really to speak of here. Whether it's been the offensive line or the ineffectiveness of Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson, maybe it's the line, maybe it's the Achilles, but Scott Baird pointed out that 31.6% of Akers carries have gained fewer than 1 yard this season. That is second only to James Robinson. Again, both those guys coming off Achilles injuries. Now, Dallas's run defense, it won't be confused for the 49ers unit that Akers and Henderson saw last week. Dallas is allowing 4.8 yards per carry this season, which has translated into 421 yards, which happens to be the 11th most. And finally, we're heading to Sunday Night Football. We've got the Cincinnati Bengals heading to the Baltimore Ravens. And hey, Cincinnati, good news for you. Baltimore's secondary has been torched all season, allowing 49 fantasy points per game to opposing receivers there. And this is after holding the Bills to 12 catches and 126 yards and a touchdown and just 30.6 fantasy points last week in the rain, in the elements there, so to speak. That said, T. Higgins, he finished last week with 25.4 fantasy points, while Jamar Chase added another 12.1 fantasy points. As his Bengals offense, it finally started to look like it was getting back to 2021 type production. On name brand alone, Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters look to provide a problem for fantasy managers. But so far this season, despite them ranking in PFF's grades there at 20 and 38th overall, in 4 weeks, this Ravens secondary has allowed opposing wide receivers 968 yards receiving, which is more than 100 more than the next closest team there. And again, those 6 touchdowns. In 21 games that Higgins and Chase have played together, Higgins has seen 166 targets and produced about 16.2 fantasy points per contest. Chase has averaged about 17.6 fantasy points per contest on 170 targets. What's more interesting, though, is that of the two, Higgins has actually been more consistent, posting at least 60 yards receiving in 14 of 17 games. Cincinnati has the best trio of wide receivers in the game today. Higgins, Chase, and Tyler Boyd. I'm not sure that Baltimore has a single reliable corner, let alone 3 reliable corners, although Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey showed last week what they could do against the Bills. Now, Burrow on Thursday Night Football last week went 267 yards, 2 touchdowns, and his yards per attempt was 9.3 with a passer rating that has increased each of the previous 4 weeks. Now, Baltimore will need to find a way to pressure Joe Burrow in this one. The Ravens last week had just 1 sack on 38 dropbacks, while Burrow was only sacked once against the Dolphins last week after being sacked 13 times in the first 2 weeks. He's been sacked just 3 times in his last 2 contests. Joe Mixon finally found the end zone in week number 4. It has been a grind after 16 scores a season ago. Mixon has been held out of the end zone despite having ample opportunities. Positive regression is coming. It has to for Mixon. He ranks first in expected fantasy points, second in rushing attempts, third in targets. So why the lack of production? How about 48th in yards per carry and yards after contact? Mixon last week had 74 yards and a touchdown on his 28 touches, with 4 of those coming in the passing game. Volume is great and all, but production matters. So far, Mixon is averaging less than 3 yards per carry. The good news is he's now facing a Ravens team that allowed Devin Singletary and the Buffalo Bills over 5 yards per attempt. Singletary last week also added in 4 more passes, 4 more receptions there for 47 yards, which is another area which the Bengals can look to exploit this week. If Mixon continues to see 20-plus carries and 4 targets a week, he should be productive once again. It's just about getting that ball rolling, getting things snowballing in a positive way. We do have another revenge game to speak of in this contest. How about Hayden Hurst facing the team that originally drafted him way back when he was a ripe age of 42 years old? Okay, he was a little bit younger than that, but you know where I'm going with this. This week, he's coming off his first touchdown as a Bengal there, and revenge plus momentum plus that beautiful head of hair, that flow going on. What more could you ask for? Now, for the Baltimore Ravens, per Elias Sports, the Ravens are just the second team in NFL history to take multiple losses after leading by more than 17 points within the first 4 games of the season, joining the 2011 Minnesota Vikings. Probably not a club that you want to belong to. Now, hopefully Coach Harbaugh gives analytics a rest this week. Now, I would have loved to be a guy or a fly in the wall in that Ravens locker room. Marcus Peters going off on the Ravens after that latest loss. Mark Andrews looking agitated after Ravens decided to go for it instead of taking the 3-point lead there against the Bills a week ago, which ultimately led to their second loss of the season. Like Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson is worth the price of admission on these previews alone. Jackson has thrown for 893 yards and a league-high 11 touchdowns while adding 2 more on the ground and another 316 yards with his legs. Jackson's average depth of target through 4 weeks has been 9.3, which is the third highest among quarterbacks. Even after a performance in which Jackson only threw for 144 yards, he did have 73 yards on the ground and tossed a couple of interceptions, he still sits atop the fantasy football rankings, averaging 29.83 fantasy points per game. Now, Jackson, he's going to have his work cut out for him once again this week, as the Bengals are allowing the fourth fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, allowing just 10.72. Cincinnati has only allowed 22 rushing yards to quarterbacks through 4 weeks. And again, they haven't really faced anyone of Lamar Jackson's caliber. Jackson will once again put his trust into Mark Andrews, who's coming off a 2-catch, 15-yard performance in Week 4 against the Bills. Now he's facing off against a Bengals team that has yet to give up a touchdown to opposing tight ends. As for Rashad Bateman, you need to keep a close eye on that injury report as we get closer to kickoff, as he is dealing with a foot injury there that limited his production a week ago. And finally, we can't finish a preview here without talking about J.K. Dobbins becoming fantasy relevant again for the first time since 2019 against the Buffalo Bills, in which he had both a receiving and a rushing touchdown. While you shouldn't expect multiple touchdowns from him each and every week, it was promising to see Dobbins get 14 carries and 4 receptions. And it appears that there's more backfield help on the way, as Gus Edwards is eligible to return for the PUP list, and you know he's going to be ready to go. You've heard from me. Now I want to hear from you. What are the games? What are the matchups? What are the headlines that you are looking forward to this week? Drop in the comments below, because I want to hear from you. Use promo code HYPE22 for 10% off your subscription over at fantasypoints.com. Hey, whatever your desire, we've got it taken care of there. Want something free to talk about? How about the different content over on the YouTube channel right now? Monday, you get the Monday grades with Wes Huber starting at 9 a.m. Eastern. Tuesdays, plugged in DFS review with Scott and Jordan there at 2 p.m. Eastern. Wednesdays, you get the midweek mailbag there, courtesy of Nick Script. And every Tuesday through Friday, you get the daily item with Joe Dolan. And I'll leave you with this as a tribute to John Hanson here. If your competition doesn't find you handsome, then head over to Fantasy Points, and at least they can find you terrific. We'll see you next time.